Good evening, members and guests, and welcome to our FPA webinar for February, Regional Power Competition in the Middle East. Thank you for joining us this evening. Our speaker this evening is our good friend, Larry Goodson. He's been with us many times before. Many of you have probably met him in past meetings, and we're so glad to have him back again this evening. I'm Howard Davison, your FPA president. I'll give a few announcements as usual. I'll then turn it over to Alan Stolberg, who will introduce the illustrious speaker this evening. And then Larry will give his presentation. Larry, you want to take your video off, please? And then we'll have Q&A. And finally, I'll close. As far as the Q&A, questions, you can type in your questions on the panel on your right of your screen anytime during the presentation. That way, Alan will have a list of questions when we get into the Q&A session. So, Matt, can we go to slide 2, please? So, a few announcements. We talked about the embassy trip before. The decision's been made. It's going to be virtual. So, I want to thank Steve Hubler for a lot of hard work. He arranged the buses. He arranged the restaurant. Then he had to cancel the buses and cancel the restaurant. But he has made the reservation for the EU, and we'll have a virtual meeting with the EU. More details will come later. That will be on Wednesday the 12th, and then probably late afternoon. And then he's trying to arrange to have the State Department virtual meeting the day before on Tuesday. So we'll have the State Department on Tuesday, and then on Wednesday, we will have the EU delegation, a speaker from the EU delegation. Both cases will have Q&A. The Tuesday date is not set yet. Steve hadn't got that yet, but we hope to have it then. So that is the embassy trip. Next is our bylaws require that we have a business meeting in April. We're going to do it by email as we did it last year. It worked out really well. Main thing we need to accomplish is the election of the officers, president, vice president, secretary, and treasurer, and the board members with terms ending 2023. So our nominating chairman will put together a list of Pete St. Pierre will put together a list of candidates and nominees for that. We will send that out to you by email along with instructions on how to vote, and then you can send in your votes. We had a very good turnout, voting turnout last year on this, and really appreciate that because our bylaws require that we have a quorum, and so it's important that everybody vote in that. I'd like to make just some recognitions here. Our scribe this evening is Abby Boland of Lebanon Valley College. She's a student in global studies. So Abby, thank you very much for volunteering, and we look forward to your summary of the meeting. In the background, we have Matt Smith, our FPA secretary, and along with Dan Kleck, of Legend Financial. Legend, of course, is our sponsor for these webinars. They're in the background, making sure everything goes smoothly. And if not, to get us back on track. So thank you very much, Matt and Dan, for that, and for Legend Financial. So that is about it for my announcements. Oh, just one other thing. Our webmaster, Bob Glasscock, has got his hands full with a full-time job plus, and could really use some help on the website. So if you would like to help out on that website, the website is based on WordPress, and Bob would really appreciate that. So if you do, either send me an email or give me a call, either way, I would appreciate that. We could really use some help on our website. Thank you. So now I'll turn it over to Alan to introduce our speaker for this evening. Alan, take it away.
Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. And this evening, we've got a great presentation in store for us with a tremendous friend of the Foreign Policy Association. For those of you who don't know, haven't been able to hear Larry Goodson before, we're in for a terrific treat. He and I came to the War College faculty at the same time in 2002. Prior to that, he got his PhD at North Carolina, was a college soccer player, He's taught in several different universities in the United States. He also taught for 6 years at the American University of Cairo. And we're with someone who is a true Middle East specialist. He did his dissertation on Afghanistan, and he was in Afghanistan before the events of 9/11, well before the events of 9/11, and he was truly an expert in that area. And as a result, in his early years at the War College, he was called upon multiple times by the American military leadership in the U.S. Central Command in Tampa for advice to do studies for them. He spent months down there advising our leadership, as well as in Washington, to include organizations like the National Intelligence Council. A true expert in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the Middle East. Now, Larry's just come off last year, he came off a one-year sabbatical that he spent as a research fellow at Oxford. And he is writing a book right now on hybrid warfare, the type of conflict that we've seen in places like Syria and Eastern Ukraine. And the work that he's doing with his case study, the work, especially in Syria, this subject is almost unprecedented. Now, because I don't want to be completely serious with everything, the sad thing is Larry cut his hair or tied it back today, because up until last night, I thought I was with the ghost of Yasser Arafat, because he had his hair down to his shoulders. But you're going to see he's cleaned himself up, and we're very lucky to have him. He's focused today on regional power and competition in the Middle East. You'll hear Larry talk about a number of different countries: Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Turkey. But the focus is going to be on 3 regional bilateral relationships. The relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia, Israel and Iran, and Turkey and the Kurds, Kurdistan. He's also going to talk to you a bit about the work that he's been doing on hybrid warfare in the Middle East region, with an emphasis on Syria. So without further ado, let me turn it over to my good friend and a really wonderful expert in this field, Dr. Larry Goodson. Larry, I think you're on, and I think you got to put yourself on camera.
Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Can hear you, cannot see you. Now we can do both. You're good. Over to you.
Good evening. It's great to see everyone. I have tied my hair back because I didn't want to offend Al too much with my COVID-19 hairstyle. I did receive my 2nd vaccine this week, so perhaps I'll be able to go out and get a haircut now before too long. Anyway, it's good to be back here at the Harrisburg Foreign Policy Association. I have had the occasion over my time at the War College to address you on a number of occasions. Always really interesting conversation, interesting questions. And so I hope tonight will be similarly, despite the situation of doing it in a webinar fashion. As Al suggested, I'm going to talk about regional power competition in the Middle East. And my intent is to talk, as he just suggested, about 5 particular countries in the region. Those will be Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Israel, and Egypt. Those are the 5 main powers in the Middle East region. What I want to do is take a few moments to go over each country in terms of some specific details their population, the important cultural components of their population, their economy, their military capability, which is something that is often shunted aside from these conversations, and their military equipment situation. Where do they get their equipment? How do they use it? And then I want to talk a little bit about how they use power, to talk about hybrid warfare, as he mentioned, but also to talk about defensive and offensive approaches to power in the Middle East. So I'm going to do that for those 5 countries. Then I'm going to talk about the 3 rivalries that he mentioned. And I will conclude by talking a little bit about the outside powers and their role in the region. And since this is the Foreign Policy Association, I'll take a last slide to talk a little bit about, what the United States might do now that we have a new administration in Washington and perhaps new approaches to the Middle East. So that's my intent. With that, I will turn immediately to Iran and talk a little bit about the situation no, I'm sorry, before I do that, I meant to mention that on each slide I have images and pictures. If I fail to go to them, Al or someone call my attention to that. So on this first slide, as part of the general focus of the conversation, you see 3 images. I'm sure anybody can figure out that the image in the middle is Turkish soldiers by virtue of the flag over their pockets in northern Syria, in the northern zone where Turkish troops have moved since 2016 in different locations. Above them, you see Iranian troops in southern Syria. You'd have to look closely at their uniforms to make out that those are Iranian forces. And then down at the bottom, you could perhaps see that these are Saudi troops in Yemen from Saudi operations against the Houthi rebels in Yemen. So these are 3 of the main countries that are engaged in the rivalries in the Middle Eastern region. So with that, Matt, we can go to the next slide. So to begin with on Iran. So its population is the 2nd largest in the region, but it is distinctive both as a Persian country and the world's largest Shia Islamic country. And I'll show you on a map a little bit later. This is a map of Iran's major nuclear sites, whether it's centrifuges or research sites or creation of ballistic missiles or whatever. These are some of the sites scattered around Iran. But I'll show you a map a little bit later that will illustrate that about 3/4 of the world's Shia population is centered on Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. It's in that sort of what some people call Shia crescent of countries. And so this is an important component of Iran's cultural definition of itself. Its more important component is that it is a Persian country, and it was once the leading empire in the world, if we go back to Cyrus the Great's time. This is also the case for Turkey. I want to talk about that as well. But both of those countries have been the leading country in the world once upon a time. And it seems that that doesn't go away very easily, even as time marches on and Britain is no longer the leading country, and other countries are no longer the leading country. These countries are no longer the leading country in the world. Perhaps, we're in an era where the United States and China are working through that arrangement as well. But in any event, those are some factors about Iran. It also has some of the world's largest oil and gas supplies, but sanctions that were reimposed after the Trump administration withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. All right, so that was the Iran nuclear deal that came about in the latter days of the Obama administration. Then Trump withdrew in 2017. It was signed in 2015 by the P5, or the key countries in the UN Security Council, plus Germany, so the P5+1 countries. And then the Trump administration withdrew in 2017. And after that, the United States imposed harsh sanctions again on Iran. Its economy is not as strong as it should be. It's suffering from these sanctions, and it wants a return to the JCPOA with the Biden administration, but it wants sanctions lifted first. Finally, Iran has the second largest military in the region after Egypt's military. And Iran's military is really divided into a domestic-focused military and police force, which is most of the military, and a foreign-focused Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, okay? It's IRGC, and then its special forces version of that are the Quds Force. So sometimes you'll see IRGC-QF for the forces that are actually abroad. Now, after the Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 1988, Iran shifted its foreign focus to the form of warfare we now call hybrid warfare, or some folks will call it gray zone warfare in the United States. You'll see both of those terms. I'm going to use hybrid warfare to talk about it with these countries, and I'm going to take a moment to cover it with Iran. Hybrid warfare, for me, this is my definition, is the use of all instruments, elements, and determinants of power in coordinated, comprehensive, and holistic ways, including violence or the threat of violence, to achieve national ends. So it is using violence or the threat of violence for a political purpose, that is to achieve national ends, but not necessarily by the military. It could be done by the intelligence service. It could be done by a criminal gang. It could be done in a variety of ways through financial or economic or cyber means to try to achieve national ends by using violence or the threat of violence. There are many, many tactics of hybrid warfare, which I could walk you through. Really, it's pretty much anything you could think of: attacking an opponent's economy, attacking an opponent's cyber systems, attacking an opponent's government and electoral systems, which Iran did in the US elections we just had, for example, spreading rumors and fake news, utilizing agents of influence, engaging in targeted assassination. I could go more. I mean, if we got into China and Russia, we could talk about deploying troops under the cover of deniability by virtue of them not wearing uniforms that show that they are Russian troops in the Crimea, for example. Or we could talk about China building islands in the South China Sea into places that they could claim as their territory and then claim territorial waters around them. I mean, there are a number of approaches. But for Iran, the key is using proxies, using Shia militias in Iraq, for example, to do any of the foregoing things I've just mentioned that would be applicable in the Iranian or the Iraqi case to achieve Iranian goals there. Hybrid war is a long-term I call it endless everywhere war. It goes on and on and on because it is not a war where you put your troops out onto the battlefield against other forces and see who can win. It's a kind of shadowy war in the background. So that's how Iran has been approaching what happens in the region, especially with its use of forces in Syria, in Iraq, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, forces in the Sinai Peninsula, in Libya, and of course, Saudi Arabia and Israel and other countries' response to those forces. I will also argue in this presentation that we can think of three major warfare approaches being used by these countries as well as others in the region. They are domestic defense, protecting the homeland. We might think of this as defensive warfare. Military operations abroad, so using your military in some situation abroad, like the pictures on the previous slide showed, and then hybrid warfare, this sort of hidden warfare that we'll talk about as we go along. So with that, we could move to the next slide. So Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a much smaller country than Iran. You see there a map of Saudi Arabia with its primary oil and non-associated natural gas regions. And you'll note that those natural gas and oil regions are mostly in the large eastern province, a very sort of large province all along the Persian Gulf, or as they would say in Saudi Arabia, the Arabian Gulf coastline in the east. That's where the oil is. It's also where the majority of the Shia population of Saudi Arabia live. Saudi Arabia's population is about 40% as big as Iran's population. It does have that large minority Shia in the oil-rich east, but it's predominantly, overwhelmingly a Sunni populated country. As you can see from its GDP per capita, it's a much more economically secure country. Its oil and gas, like Iran's oil and gas, are among the leading oil and gas countries in the world. It's also the leader of the Gulf Cooperation Council of Arab countries, those Gulf countries, the UAE and Bahrain and Qatar and Kuwait and Oman and Saudi Arabia, that are right there on the opposite side of Iran. Saudi Arabia's military is much smaller than Iran's military and more focused on internal security, in part because of the role that it plays by its position as recipient of huge religious pilgrimages every year. The two major pilgrimages, the Hajj and Umrah, which go to Mecca and Medina, are involve millions of people that come there, and a good chunk of the military is deployed every year to maintain the situation of having hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Muslims from all over the world inside Saudi Arabia and performing the rites and religious practices of that religion. So that's one of the reasons, but more important reason is that it is engaged in a war with Iran through these proxy forces that Iran has been using in numerous countries, right? The proxy forces in Yemen, the proxy forces that Iran has used since our invasion of Iran in the early part of this century in Iraq, those proxy forces in southern Iraq, proxy forces in Syria and in Lebanon, in all of these sort of neighboring or near neighboring countries, Saudi Arabia has been facing Iran. It has also engaged since 2015 in direct military operations in Yemen and against strikes, missile strikes and so forth from Yemen into Saudi Arabia. And so much of its focus has been in these kinds of warfare. It has also used, through its intelligence service, the GIP you see there at the bottom, it's also used hybrid warfare approaches in some of these countries as well, especially in Syria, supporting various Sunni groups in the Syrian conflict and in Iraq. But I would say that much of its focus has been on domestic defense and then more recently in the military operations in Yemen. So with that, Matt, we could go forward to the next slide. Okay, so now Turkey. With Turkey, obviously Turkey has a population that is much closer to Iran's population. Egypt is the largest, then Iran, then Turkey. 20, 30 years ago, Turkey, Iran, and Egypt all had the same population. Egypt's population has exploded, so it's considerably larger, but Turkey and Iran have sort of been going up roughly in the same way. Like Iran, as I said before, Turkey once had a large empire that ruled the Middle East, right? It was the Ottoman Empire before World War I brought an end to the Ottoman Empire. And so the Turks, like the Iranians, also have this sense of themselves as having once ruled the world, or a large chunk of the world, since the Ottoman Empire ruled not only much of the Middle East, but also much of Europe, and went to the gates of Vienna a couple of times, where, had they gotten beyond Vienna, the Turks might have ruled much of Central and Western Europe as well. So Turkey is a major country in the region as well. We often don't think of it this way because we think of Turkey in its European context, right? It has a bit of land in southeastern Europe, and it is a member of NATO. It's actually the second leading country in NATO in terms of its military forces after the United States. So it's been a critical country for Europe as well, and sort of is caught between Europe, the Middle East, and then its sort of Asian dimension. You see its population is predominantly Turks. There's also about 19% or so of the population that are Kurds, and it's overwhelmingly almost 100% Muslims in Turkey. Its economy is different. I mean, you see a lower GDP per capita than Saudi Arabia's, lower than Israel's, higher than Iran's, but its economy is different than either Iran or Saudi Arabia's economy. In neither case, unlike Iran or Saudi Arabia, Turkey's economy is not reliant on oil. It has a mixture of both agriculture and what we might think of as a European economy, an economy that's more centered on manufacturing, on producing things rather than extracting oil and then leveraging that to build the other sectors of the economy, which is how Saudi Arabia and Iran developed their modern economies. Now they're moving away from that to some extent, but Turkey's economy has gone in a different direction already. It is a member of NATO, as I said, but its rising neo-Ottoman sentiment, which is supposed to be realized by 2023, this is something that the president of Turkey, Erdogan, has been quite focused on, as well as Russian pressure on Turkey, are causing it to change or consider changing its international position. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on. So I'll come back to that. Its military is large and focused on internal defense, primarily focused on the Kurds, right, who are strongly supportive of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK as it's known in Turkey. And they are in the southeast and central part of Turkey, so as well as, of course, in the major cities. So there have been a number of sort of counterterrorism operations against those Kurds, but the Turks have moved into northern Syria against the Kurdish forces that grew strong there against the Assad regime in Damascus, right? And they grew strong in the north, especially the northeastern part of Syria. So the map I put on here, and I realize it's not a very good map. I tried to find a good map, but if you can look at it, you see where it says Turkey up there. So right underneath Turkey is are two green areas with a light, two purple areas with a light purple area in the middle. So that light purple area is where the Turks came into northern Syria against the Rojava area, which is that orange area underneath, to take control of that area of northern Syria in 2019. Operation Peace Spring, they called it in 2019. They control that area up there, separating the Kurdish zone that was there from east to west. Now, if you move further west, also in that same area of northern Syria, you'll see some green area right along the border as well. Those were the other two operations. Operation Euphrates Shield in 2016, which came in to the green area just to the west of the purple area, and then Operation Olive Branch in 2018, which came into the area around Afrin, a little further west from Jarablus. So those are the three Turkish zones in northern Syria, really designed to push out the Kurds away from their connection to the Kurds in Turkey. They've also used hybrid warfare by their intelligence organization known as MIT in Syria and Iraq, primarily against Kurdish targets, as well as, of course, in Turkey. So this is a country that also has a large military, is using different approaches, but primarily focused domestically, but not entirely. And we'll talk about the Turkish-Kurdish rivalry here in a couple of minutes. If you want to move forward, Matt, to the next one. So let me just say a few quick words about Israel and Egypt, not as much, especially about Egypt, because of the way the rivalries have shaped up, but I didn't want to leave them off the table. Israel, of course, you look at Israel, you say, wow, tiny population compared to the other regional powers. And of course, it's the homeland to the Jewish population of the Middle East and really of the world, which has caused a long-standing struggle with the Arab population within Israel and also in and around its neighborhood. Now, all of this has made the military in Israel much more powerful than a small country typically has or maybe should have, as Israel has fought its Arab neighbors in 1948, 1956, 1967, 1973, 1978, the intifadas in the 80s and the 90s, the fight with Lebanon in 2006, and then various fights within the Gaza Strip or within the West Bank, all along the way, as well as in other times that I didn't just mention. So by virtue of all of this, Israel has a large, highly capable military, the best military really in the region, and Israel is the one country in the region that possesses nuclear weapons. It doesn't admit to possessing nuclear weapons. If we have an Israeli here today, he will say, oh, we don't have nuclear weapons, but they do have nuclear weapons. They've had them now since the 1970s, and they simply don't admit them and don't subscribe to any of the agreements regarding them, but they do have them. Israel also has, I forgot to mention this for Saudi Arabia that it's a country that relies heavily on foreign military sales, whereas as does Turkey to some extent and Iran to some extent. Israel, on the other hand, produces a lot of its own very high-end military equipment. And so it's really a country that has a much more robust military than you would think it would have, as any other country with a population of less than 9 million people would have. Of course, Israel has also, as a byproduct of all the fighting and as a manifestation of political Zionism, taken and held on to the West Bank and Gaza Strip, which contain about 5 million Palestinian Arabs. So along with the 25% or so Arabs within Israel, Israel's population and the Palestinian population are pretty close to each other. This means then that Israel's military uses all forms of operations, as shown in the slide. While the domestic defense is occupying Palestinian land and is generally perceived by the Arabs as following, being military operations against the Arabs, the Israelis see that differently. They see it as protecting themselves. So I'm calling that defensive operations when I'm referring to the Palestinian lands. Military operations against neighboring countries is ongoing and, of course, recent, as I've already suggested. In particular, operations in Syria and ongoing troubles with Lebanon, dating since the 2006 war, but before that. And hybrid warfare approaches have been used by the Israelis in a number of cases down through the ages against a number of countries, but today are most significant in regard to Iran, where Israel is very concerned about nuclear weapons. They've used everything from computer viruses to assassinations of nuclear scientists. We saw one very recently against Iran, and they will undoubtedly continue to use those operations going forward. I skipped over the economy. Israel's economy is unique in the Middle East. It's very much a global economy, very high technology, high levels of research and development, the world's largest number of startup companies, cut diamonds, industrial equipment. Israel is really a different type of economy than the other economies in the region. So if you want to go forward, Matt, I'll just say a few quick words about Egypt. Egypt is really kind of left off the table here. I mean, I'm mentioning Egypt, it's here. It has the largest population. It's pretty much all Egyptians, although about 10% of the population are Christians that are also Egyptians. Most of the population is Muslim, but about 10% are Christians, which is the largest Christian population in the Middle East. The economy is the weakest of the 5 countries I've mentioned. It has the largest military and a problem with Islamist radicals in the Sinai Peninsula that are connected to ISIS and before that to other Islamist groups from outside the region. For that reason, Egypt has deployed a chunk of its military, its army primarily, into the Sinai Peninsula, mostly focusing on the northern Sinai to try to eliminate the problem in the Sinai. There have also been Egyptian use of forces in the Libyan conflict, right, that is next door. And then Egypt rather has used hybrid warfare in the past towards Israel, back in the days when they were fighting with Israel and others, but that is less of a feature for Egypt, which has a large military and is focused primarily internally than it would be for other countries. That's even though, one of our former students, one of my former students for that matter, Al-Sisi, the president of Egypt, was a war college student and studied here. And so they do have a large military. They do use it, but it's very focused primarily on its internal defense. I have a picture here of the now twin lane Sinai Peninsula or Suez Canal next to the Sinai Peninsula. So the Sinai on one side, you see the land of Africa on the other side. To remind you that while Egypt doesn't have the oil wealth and the non-associated gas wealth, doesn't have the economy of Turkey or Israel, it does possess a key choke point for the container ships and the oil cargo carriers coming out of the Arabian Peninsula or out of China coming further east and into the Mediterranean and on to Europe and elsewhere. So that's Egypt, which otherwise will be set aside. It's not as significant for the rivalries as these other countries that I'd like to talk to. With that, I'd just like to turn and say a few quick words about the rivalries and then wrap this up and turn my attention to any questions. Now, the first rivalry, the big rivalry, is between Iran and Saudi Arabia. These countries are divided on multiple levels. I've tried to identify that already for you, so I won't go back into it. They're both dominant global suppliers in oil and gas. They both want to control the Persian Gulf, and they have identity differences, the Persian versus Arab and the sectarian division between Shia and Sunni Islam, right? Saudi Arabia also sees Iran as behind Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Yemen, as I mentioned, and it fears Shia unrest in the eastern province as well as the broader Persian Gulf. Every Middle Eastern conflict now has Iranian and Saudi involvement on the opposing sides. Now, the upper map you see there, I took from the Wikipedia page. All right, I should have put it in there, but I'm telling you anyway. You see where Saudi Arabia in orange and Iran in green are. All those red countries are countries where these rivals are having, in effect, proxy warfare with each other. You see, of course, Iraq and Syria and Lebanon. You see Yemen. You might also be able to see Qatar there. You can see Libya. You can see Morocco, where they're debating over, the Polisario in the Western Sahara. You can see Nigeria. You can see Afghanistan and Pakistan. You might be aware that they have taken opposing sides in the recent fall fighting between Armenia and Azerbaijan in just north of Iran, and of course even in Bosnia in Eastern Europe. So they are at odds with each other all over the region. Iran sees Saudi Arabia as being behind efforts to encircle and overturn that regime since 1979, when the Islamic Revolution came about in Iran. That was also when the U.S. Embassy was taken over in Tehran, which has led to great animosity between the United States and Iran ever since. Iran is now supported more heavily by Russia. Saudi Arabia, of course, especially in the Trump administration, supported more heavily by the United States. As I mentioned before, the lower map shows you in the dark green colors where the Shia are. And so you could sort of look at that map and see where they are, especially in Iran, southern Iraq, in Syria, along the Mediterranean coast, in Turkey and Afghanistan. And then you can't quite see it off the map, but down in the lower provinces of Saudi Arabia, down into Yemen, there's also a segment of Shia population, versus the light green, which is the population density of the Sunni population. You can see Egypt, you can see most of Turkey. Well, Saudi Arabia doesn't have a high density except in the cities, but you can see in Saudi Arabia, northern Iraq, and so forth. Okay, the next slide, please. So the rivalry between Iran versus Israel, and this is a map showing how Israel might attack Iran's nuclear sites. It's an earlier map from earlier in the last decade. These countries are also divided by identity between religion, Jewish versus Muslim, and then specifically the Shia Islamism, the radical approach to using Islam in a political way that Iran has tried to use as part of its foreign policy. And the real focus in the earlier part of the last decade by the Iranian regime to highlight Israel and really focus on Israel as a horrible place that needed to be eliminated and driven into the sea and all this sort of thing, and their pursuit of nuclear weapons. Now, as we know, the Obama administration pushed very hard for a resolution of the nuclear weapons approach with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, as I mentioned, and then the Trump administration came in and undid that. That has sort of thrown a wrench into the problem of what to do about this approach of Iran getting nuclear weapons. Iran, of course, sees Israel very correctly as attacking its territory and population via hybrid warfare, whereas, as I just said, Israel sees Iran as determined to destroy the state of Israel using more immediately the local actors, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and other organizations to sort of realize this purpose. Because of that, in the last several years, Israel has been aligning with Saudi Arabia and some other GCC states against Iran. Israel, of course, is strongly supported by the USA. And as I said on the previous slide, just reminding you, the USA and Iran have great animosity since the 1979 embassy takeover. Now, hidden behind that is the reality that in the 60s and 70s, no country in the Middle East was closer to the United States than Iran. They were our favorite country in the Middle East, ahead of Israel, ahead of all the Arab countries. And so that relationship is, theoretically, we could go back to that relationship. In reality, the changing dynamics of the region has made that very hard to do. Let's go to the next slide, the last rivalry here. Thanks, Matt. So lastly, I want to say a little word about Turkey and the Kurds. This is a different dynamic. It's not between a country and another country, right? It's between Turkey and an ethnic group. And I want to emphasize this. It's not entirely fair to put this on Turkey. The Kurds wanted to have their own country after World War I, when all these countries were being drawn in the Middle East, right? And they sort of got shunted aside in the Versailles Treaty and all the processes in the Middle East, and got divided between Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. So you can see in this upper map where the Kurds are. You see them in eastern, southeastern Turkey, you see them in northern Syria, you see them in northern Iraq, and you see them in western or northwestern Iran. They're divided by ethnicity and power between these countries, because even though they are a contiguous ethnic group with a long-standing history and culture and language and all of that, and so they could easily be a country, right? You could just draw a line around those neighborhoods and you could have a country. But obviously that takes away from the countries that were created. So that's not really a solution that anyone is in favor of. For that reason, they have been used and abused by all of those countries in regard to the power arrangements in other countries. I wrote a piece that some of you may have seen in the Army War College War Room in the fall of 2019 when Turkey went into northern Iraq and we stepped, or northern Syria rather, and we stepped aside from our Kurdish allies in northern Syria. And in it, I emphasize that this is not a new thing, that the Shah of Iran, back when they were our good buddies in the 1970s, did the same thing and sold the Kurds out in northern Iraq against Saddam Hussein when the Kurds there were fighting against Saddam Hussein on behalf of the US government and the Iranian government, when Iraq and the Shah of Iran signed a deal that allowed then the Kurdish revolution to be put down by Saddam Hussein, a deal that Henry Kissinger was famous for signing off on and helping to sell the Kurds out back in the mid 1970s. So the situation today, though, is that the Turks are focused against the Kurds, in part because the Kurds not only live in the eastern part, but they occupy Turkey's southeastern Anatolia project, or GAP as it's known. Now, the lower map shows that. You'll see where the Turks have constructed these dozens of dams and hydroelectric irrigation ditches along the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. You can see the different dams. There's sort of little black areas in that lower map, and then some planned dams that will go in other areas. The Turks see the Kurds as part of this terrorist organization, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, and then the Kurds in northern Iraq and northern Syria are threatening to the Turks, because obviously if they get autonomous zones there, then the Kurds in Turkey might want the same thing. Turkey is part of NATO, as I mentioned again there, just to remind you that they can't be too heavily focused against the Kurds because of the standards of NATO, but on the other hand, they continue to maintain that this is a counterterrorism problem in their country. This is a problem that won't go away because the Kurds exist in these other countries as well. So if you go to my last couple of slides, Matt. So let me just say a quick word now about the outside powers. I've tried to cover as quickly as I could the internal powers within the region. But I do want to say a little bit about this book I've been working on since I went to Oxford. And I've heard from friends, by the way, that we were there at the perfect time. The weather was beautiful and COVID hadn't existed at that point, and that Oxford and all the great towns of England are very similar to our cities and college towns today, as places that have sort of gone into hibernation for a long period of time. But in any event, I've been working on a book that focuses on the title, The First Great War of the 21st Century. And in it, I make an argument that there are certain wars in history that we can call great wars, not great power wars between two great powers. A great war is what I say there. It's a large war territorially, you see spans more than one continent or region, produces excessive death and destruction, usually somewhere between 3 to 5% of the population in the region or globe if it's a global conflict. So today that would be, I don't know, 350, 400 million people if we had such a conflict, and I'm saying we do. It involves multiple great powers on opposing sides, and ultimately it produces profound changes to the existing world order. I have argued with my research assistants who've done most of this work for me that we now have 14 great wars in history going back to the ancient days, starting with the Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage, or what would be today Tunisia, and going forward to World War II in the 20th century. And that we're now in the early phases of a great war between the United States, China, and Russia. But this war is largely a war being fought at the moment in a hybrid fashion to keep those three countries from moving up to a nuclear conflict. And as I've said in these last points here, the USA has been the dominant power in the Middle East, but our fighting there has not been entirely productive. You see a slide there, or rather an image there, that shows where US troops are based in the Middle East as of, I think it was 2019. So some slight adjustments to that, but you can see that we are in the Middle East. That's the first image there. The second image of those troops are Russian troops from the Wagner Corporation, or the Wagner Company. These are Russian mercenaries that are wearing, military uniforms with no insignia at all. They are in Syria in this operation, so you can see them there. And then finally, you see a map of China's Belt Road Initiative, which is designed to bring its economic strength to Western Europe, to Africa. So you see both the road over land and the road through the sea into the Indian Sea to Eastern Africa, and then up through the Red Sea into the Mediterranean. This is critical for China. It means that China needs the oil out of the Persian Gulf. Hence, you have the Pakistan-China economic corridor running from the bottom end of Pakistan up into the western part of China. But even more important is China's ability to come into Turkey and become a centerpiece in moving into the Eastern Mediterranean. So I just wanted to touch on this a little bit to suggest to you that whatever happens in the Middle East is maybe not the end of this challenge between these three big powers. But with that, let me go to my last slide and wrap this thing up. What should the United States do? You'll see on the left side where I wrote some general points, and then the right side where I put down some quotes from some recent news articles. Basically, the difficulties we have in the United States with the new Biden administration, but these difficulties apply to the Trump administration, the Obama, the Bush, they go back, is that we can't really have a coherent Middle East policy. We want certain national interests that are divisive towards each other. We want to support Israel. We also want to support the oil-rich countries that for a long time have been central to U.S. Oil policy, for example. And even if we've changed our policy because of the advent of shale oil, the reality is most of the oil reserves that have been very important have come out of the Persian Gulf. Much of the world's 6,000 or more products that are made by oil, like all plastic, for example, are coming out of oil that's going to China and is coming out of other places other than the United States. So, but in any event, we can't have a coherent Middle East policy. We can't have a military first policy in the Middle East. We cannot avoid having a great war in the region, or a war that is global between the three countries I mentioned, but has a Middle Eastern dimension. And that sort of leaves us with transactional policy as a sort of leftover solution, I guess you could say, of what we can do in the region. We can return to the JCPOA, although this illustrates the problem with transactional policy. Saudi Arabia and Israel will both oppose that vehemently. We can encourage Iran and Saudi Arabia away from proxy fights in neighboring countries. So far, that hasn't worked very well. We can continue to urge Turkey to step away from Russia's air defense system and to abandon its control of northern Syrian territory. Well, we can do that. It's not clear that it's going to really produce much from Turkey on those issues. We could try to get Israel to change its policy and finally adopt the two-state policy with the Palestinians in Israel, but that doesn't seem likely either. And so as you see, if you've read on the right side, Biden doesn't see the Middle East as being in his top three. This is in a recent Politico article from one of his top advisors. You see the Turkish article from SETA there, that his relations will be less friendly with the three big countries in the region, and the US will not find it easy to normalize relations with Iran. So in other words, it's going to be tough in the region. And then you see our former general from CENTCOM, Joseph Votel, who recently wrote that we must review and identify, articulate our enduring interest in the region. We have to make sure our military efforts don't eclipse our other elements of national power. We must make every effort to rebuild relationships and partnerships in the region. Now, I like Joe Votel a lot. He's good. But you can clearly see these are very aspirational ideas for what the US can do in the region, all of which seem sort of impossible or unlikely in the near term to me. But anyway, I've gone on a bit too long, I think, but those are my efforts to try to rush through these countries and their rivalries and their issues to at least give you a general overview of the situation, at least at the regional level in the Middle East. And so thank you very much. Back to you, Al, or whoever is up next.
Well, Larry, thank you very much. Obviously, another great tour de force of the entire region. Very few could have done it as well. Got some questions for you. And let me start off first with the relationship, the bilateral relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia. Where do you see that going now in this new period with President Biden and his administration? Over to you, please.
Can you hear me? Should
Yes.
be able. Okay, I left mine on. We know that in the early days of the Trump administration, President Trump reached out to Saudi Arabia, deepened the relationship with Saudi Arabia, and specifically deepened the relationship with between his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince and son of the current king of Saudi Arabia, who's elderly and not as well. The Biden administration has thus far not moved in that direction, in that same direction. To the best of my knowledge, his first and most significant call in the Middle East was to the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, so the bilateral relationship then with the United States and Saudi Arabia is likely to slide back a bit, as was suggested in that last slide. The relationship will not be as warm and fuzzy going forward. It's clear that the Biden administration wants to return to the JCPOA, which Saudi Arabia considers to be detrimental to its national interests. it's odd in a way because, you know, I mean, just to get to the details of this, the JCPOA really focused on reducing uranium and plutonium in Iran rather, and eliminating the higher level production of its centrifuges. So it was designed to take away the nuclear option. It didn't touch the proxy warfare. It didn't touch what was happening in Syria or Yemen or any of those places. And a lot of folks, obviously the Trump administration, for example, but also a lot of these countries in the region really want to see that added in there. It's not clear that you can go there since that's central to Iran's policy in the region in terms of how it interacts with Shia populations in these various countries, and as it opposes Saudi Arabia. So it will be hard for Biden to straddle these divides, as I mentioned before. On the other hand, the United States is the major military supplier for Saudi Arabia, and there's no reason to suspect that that's not going to continue in some shape or form. The United States has a long relationship with Saudi Arabia, and so I anticipate that Biden will move in that direction. But the final bit, that if in fact the United States sees China or the Western Pacific, Europe, and the Western Hemisphere as the three key regions, and the Middle East moves into the backwaters of US foreign policy, if that's allowed to happen, and obviously events could reshape that, then it may well be that we'll see a period of less favorable bilateral relations with Saudi Arabia. Sorry,
Okay.
that's kind of a bad answer.
Well, if this stuff was simple, you wouldn't be with us. Next time, we've got two questions that are related to the new relationships that have emerged in the last year between Israel and some of the moderate Gulf states. How do you see that impacting Israel's stance in the region and the potential for peaceful, more stability in the region? Over to you, please.
Okay, yeah, I was expecting that one as well. Clearly, some of those relationships were developed as a byproduct of our willingness to provide weapon systems, capabilities that would be used against Iran primarily, one would assume, for the Gulf states, and that deepening relationship with Saudi Arabia. These were the high points, really, one could say, of the Trump administration's foreign policy towards the Middle East. If we're talking about the Gulf states and not about states in Africa anyway. The Biden administration, from everything I've been able to see in these first few weeks anyway, appears to endorse and accept those. It's not clear to me that all the weapons will go to the UAE, but it appears that we're going to continue with that relationship and try to use our economic capability in providing these weapons to support and secure the Israeli, and in that case, the UAE relationship. So I think all of those things are going to happen. I don't think that we will necessarily see Israel fundamentally changing its attitude towards the Palestinians, or doing those things that traditionally kept the Arab states around the region from making those arrangements with Israel that until now were primarily decisions made by the Egyptian and Jordanian government. And it may reflect that the Palestinian issue is just losing its potency with the Arab populations, especially in those more economically secure states like UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Qatar, those states that are along the coastline of Saudi Arabia.
Okay, thank you. Next one. This relates to Iran in the post-Khomeini era. Which faction or factions are likely to succeed him, and how would that affect regional rivalries?
Say it again, please.
This question relates to Iran in the post-Khomeini period. Which faction or factions are likely to succeed Khomeini, and how would that affect regional rivalries?
Okay, got you. You mean the current Ayatollah
Correct.
Khamenei, not Khomeini.
Khamenei, I'm sorry. Yes.
No, I got you. I'm just making sure because the names are very close together.
That's the reason they sent me to study Russian. Go ahead, please.
Oh gosh. Well, the really tough language is Turkish. Oh my gosh. But anyway, that's a different subject. Russian's pretty darn tough too. So that's a $1 million question we have with every one of these countries in the region. They're all regional countries with not all of them, but many of them with monarchies, or in this case, a kind of permanent regime of the clergy with the Grand Ayatollah on top. And yes, Khamenei is elderly now and will soon pass from the throne over there, or the Grand Ayatollah position. We have seen in Iran sort of conservative or revolutionary factions that especially have been in the IRGC, in the Interior Ministry, at times in the Foreign Ministry, sort of pushing this international approach of Iran in the region. And then we've seen these more moderates that have been coming up and wanting to focus economic wealth and well-being on the population. I mean, that's an unfair and very general way of putting it. In reality, all of these folks, whether it's Rouhani or Ahmadinejad or any of these folks, the more moderate or the more revolutionary, have to be selected and brought forth by the clergy to run for office and to be considered, whether it's for the presidency or whether it's for the parliament or whatever it may be in the government. So it's not clear really which will come forward. There has been dispute within the Iranian regime and those people that are following it very closely that maybe in the wake of the death of Qasem Soleimani, that we killed last January in Iraq, that led to upheaval in that country between Iran and the United States, that we would see new forces arise and we might be able to determine who we might see that would replace Khamenei. But it's not clear to me. When Khamenei came up, he wasn't even a Grand Ayatollah. He was elevated into that position and given that title before he really had it as the successor to Khomeini, right? So we've only been through so far 2 of these folks since the Islamic Revolution in 1979. Now they routinely have elections for presidents and members of parliament and all these other titles, but it's really under the leadership of the clergy. it seems to me that they're likely to continue down the same path they've been on, because it would be a major foreign policy change to back away from supporting these groups. And the reason I missed your quote was my wife just slipped in and gave me a note saying a U.S. airstrike on Iranian-backed Syria now, breaking news, which must have come about in just the last few minutes. So that's why I was a little distracted there at the beginning, trying to figure out what was actually going on at the moment. Anyway, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you. That's it's never dull, this work. Next question, please. And this is going to be the first of the last three questions for the evening. The first one concerns the potential options for the Biden administration in Afghanistan. Presuming that there are no good options, what's the least bad option? Is it to muddle along and keep enough forces there to prevent the government from collapsing? Over to you, please.
Yeah, of course, that's a tough question. I gave an interview several weeks ago on this question when the interviewer really was asking me, why are we beginning to talk about, so the Biden administration's key policy leaders, right? Lloyd Austin at the Secretary of Defense and Jake Sullivan at the NSC. Hello, did I lose you? Hello?
No, we're good.
Okay.
We're here.
Anyway, those folks had just begun to talk about whether we would go forward with the deal with the Taliban or not. And some of the debate is really over whether the Taliban can attack the Afghan government or not. They've been careful to largely stay away from attacking the US government or the US forces in Afghanistan, and we have been drawing forces down from Afghanistan, but they have attacked the Afghan government. They've attacked a number of cities. There have been a number of attacks in Kabul. And so the war is still continuing on. It's not clear that the Ghani government can survive in Afghanistan without the United States or some outside power there to help the Afghan military forces keep the government in power. It seems to me that General Miller in Afghanistan, General Austin now in the Secretary of Defense, or Secretary Austin, and the folks on the NSC are probably going to argue that we need to continue to maintain forces in Afghanistan even beyond the May deadline. And so moving away a little bit from what was at least possibly agreed to with the Taliban based on their behavior towards the Afghan government. I think that's the best solution, personally, to me. It's not clear that we'll go there. President Biden, when he was vice president in Afghanistan, expressed some real frustration with the Ghani government back then, and like President Trump, isn't desirous of staying much longer in Afghanistan. Obviously, if we were to pull back, then probably the Taliban would consider us a fair game for more fighting. So I could see both sides of it. I think I would keep forces on the ground and continue to try to keep the situation stable, or as stable as you can. But it's a war, so that isn't necessarily going to work. I don't see a good solution. Withdrawing and then watching the Afghan government go down in flames would also be sort of disastrous from the point of view of why did we do all of that in the first place? So I could see both sides of it. I'm just telling you, for me, I would keep some forces in there.
No, thank you for that, Larry. Next one, please. Another non-controversial question. What are the primary interests of the United States in the Middle East?
Okay, so over time, we've had somewhere between 4 and 6 interests. All right, if I can just, I won't run through all of them, right? The Cold War and all that, but in the last, say in the 21st century, they've centered on free access, or at least, regional security, which tends to focus on access to oil, which we once really relied upon. Now, of course, we've revolutionized the shale oil in this country and in Canada. But in any event, that was one. Second was counterterrorism. Third was nuclear proliferation. Okay. And then you get into the security and stability, or at least the security of the state of Israel. And then after that, you'll remember that President Obama came in, went to the university in Cairo, and talked about democracy and human rights. President Carter, once upon a time, also talked about human rights in the Middle East. So you have that dimension to US policy. President Bush came in and wanted to emphasize the rise of democracy in Iraq and in other places in the Middle East. So that would be another dimension to it. It seems to me that is sort of agreeing in a way with President Biden and those quotes that were on the last slide. I think we're going to push the Middle East back, largely based on the reality that we don't draw so much oil from the Middle East anymore. China does, right? And other countries do, but not us. Israel is pretty darn secure, and we are going to support Israel. So, that one is still there for us, even though Israel has ongoing difficulties with its neighbors, especially Lebanon. But Israel can clearly secure itself. We'll continue to support Egypt. We'll continue to support Saudi Arabia and these countries with military equipment. And I think we'll continue, even though the Arab Spring sort of became the Arab winter, we'll probably continue to push the Arab countries to realize, democracy or human rights or political liberalization, because we think it's better for the world in general. We think it would be better for them. Having said all of that, though, I really think that this is going to become a second-tier region for the Biden administration, unless things get so bad in the region that we have to embark on major military operations, or I should say, also, we want to probably try to keep our feet in the region because of the growing Chinese influence that I think we'll see in the region coming in the next several years ahead. So I would say the enduring interests are probably what I just stated, but still it's not going to be as significant a region as it was for the first, say, 20 years of this century's period.
Okay. And my apologies to all, but this has to be the final question of the evening. And this concerns American military influence in Egypt with bases or with personnel. Questions like, does General Dynamics still building Abrams tanks there? Is the U.S. still patrolling the Sinai with the MFO? Over to you, Larry, for the last question, please.
Yeah, well, not so much bases, as you say, but personnel. And forgive me if I'm wrong, but I think the United States is still patrolling in the Sinai, although that is a mission that other countries are engaged in. It's a, multinational organization, not just one country. I think the tank production and some of the other military production was handed over, or partially handed over to Egyptians. So I think some of that now is with Egypt. That's a question. If you have a particular person who wants to reach out to me by email, or if you want to give it to them, I'll have to look that one up and give it back to you, because I'm not 100% sure about that one. I just haven't thought about it lately. Or maybe if Chris Bolin or someone is on, maybe who knows the answer, I don't know. But in any event, I'm not sure, but I'm happy to look that up and reach out to your individual for that one.
Okay. No, and Larry, that's fine. And again, my my apologies to all, but I think we've got to call it an evening. So in Arabic, shukran. Thank you very, very much for another wonderful analysis. And let me turn it over to Howard Davidson, please.
Yes, Larry, thank you very much for another excellent presentation. You've done it again for us, so we really appreciate having such an expert in the Middle East to talk to the Foreign Policy Association. So I'd like to draw your attention to the next slide, the last slide here of the evening, and showing what our schedule is going to be for next month. So on the 18th, we're going to have a moderated webinar, a moderated Q&A webinar, which means our Alan Stolberg will be asking questions of Dr. Hal Brands on the subject of the impact of the COVID pandemic on the international system, which is Dr. Brands' expertise. This is a very important individual, and we're very lucky to have him in this. And Alan asked that if you have questions that you would like to have in this moderated Q&A, that you send them to him. So when we announce this, I will send out an email and I will remind you that Alan would like to have your questions ahead of time for this moderated Q&A. So that's next month, and we look forward to seeing you next month. And until then, good night, everybody. Hope you enjoyed this evening's presentation.